Hello, everyone. My name is Sudi, and today I'll be presenting this article titled Expedited Pathway Insights Unveiling Oncology and Non-Oncology Drug Approvals and Withdrawals of USFDA and EU EMA. This paper was published in the Critical Reviews in Oncology and Hematology Journal in January of this year. A quick agenda overview. So we will first begin with an introduction, then a methods section, go over the US and EU expedited approval processes, the results, pre and post approval hurdles, and then finish with the conclusion and discussion. To begin, I'd like to give an introduction on the drug development pathway. As I'm sure most of us are aware, the drug development process takes about 12 years, but often much longer. It begins with target identification, then drug discovery and optimization, preclinical studies in animals, then clinical studies in humans. Developing a new drug costs often an average of almost $3 billion. This extended timeline, along with high financial costs, underscores a need for alternative regulatory approaches, which are expedited approvals. Expedited approval pathways were created to help bring potentially life-saving drugs to patients faster. The purpose of this article was to analyze oncological and non-oncological drug approvals through expedited pathways by the US FDA and EU EMA.
Flyer title. You know why it's so confusing?
The researchers used mostly databases as their methods. So they analyzed all drug approvals in the US and Europe from 2020 to 2023. For the US, they used FDA databases, including the Novel Drug Approvals Database and Withdrawn Cancer Accelerated Approvals Database, among others. And for the EU, they used the Human Medicines Highlights Database and the Prime 5-Year Report, both of which are sources from the EMA. So the traditional process of drug approval in the US starts with drug development and preclinical animal studies, as we have already mentioned. Then the IND is submitted and clinical trials can begin. After phase 3 trials are completed, an NDA is filed, and then phase 4 trials can begin. The FDA can take up to 12 months to review a new NDA. To speed up this process then, 4 expedited approval pathways were created: Fast Track designation, Breakthrough Therapy designation, Accelerated approval, and Priority review. Fast Track designation is for a medication that treats an unmet medical need with clinical or non-clinical evidence, or a medication that is recognized as a qualifying infectious disease product. With this designation, applicants can interact frequently with the FDA while still in clinical trials to optimize the data required for approval. This program also allows something called a rolling review, which means applicants can submit their data in portions as they become available rather than waiting to submit all data at once. This allows the development and review process to go a little faster. The Breakthrough Therapy designation is for a medication meant to treat serious conditions with initial clinical evidence that demonstrates the medication may significantly outperform existing treatments. It's really important that it may significantly outperform existing treatments. And with this program as well, the FDA provides intensive guidance to help applicants develop their product, and rolling review is also a feature of Breakthrough Therapy. The Accelerated Approval Program is for a medication that manages severe conditions and offers significant benefit over current treatment. It enables potential drugs to be approved based on preliminary data and surrogate endpoints or intermediate clinical endpoints, and thus requires post-approval trials to validate the anticipated clinical benefits. And then lastly, Priority review is for a medication that treats severe conditions and will show a difference in safety and effectiveness if approved. This program shortens the NDA or BLA review time from 12 months to around 6 to 8 months. So the EU has three similar expedited approval pathways: PRIME, which stands for primary medicines, and then accelerated assessments and conditional marketing authorization. PRIME is similar to our breakthrough therapy designation, where increased involvement with the EMA can quicken the process. Accelerated assessment is similar to the FDA's priority review because it shortens the standard review time of 210 days to 150 days. And conditional marketing authorization is similar to the FDA's accelerated approval, where the drug is approved based on less comprehensive data and requires post-approval trials. Okay, so we are going to get into the results now. After compiling and graphing the data, the authors observed general trends in expedited approval pathways from the years 2020 to 2023. The first, among the 72 drugs with fast track designation during this period, 33% were indicated for oncology treatments, while 66% were for non-oncology conditions. For priority review, around 40% of drugs were approved for oncology conditions, and for breakthrough therapy, there was about a 50-50 split between oncology and non-oncology related drugs. Here, the most notable result was for accelerated approvals, of which 75% were for oncology indications, a much larger percentage compared to the other expedited approval pathways. Additionally, between 2020 and 2023, the trend of new drug approvals for both oncological and non-oncological indications shows a reliance on multiple expedited pathways. For example, 65% of all drugs in 2023 utilized more than one pathway, and 55% did in 2022. I just wanted to note here that even though the percentage of accelerated approvals for oncology drugs is the largest, the y-axes of the graphs are actually not the same, so the proportions are a little bit off. And the actual number of oncology drugs approved is greater in priority approvals. So we can see that with the red columns being around 15 or 10, which is larger than the 8 or 6 in accelerated approvals. In the EU, EMA conditional approvals from 2020 to 2023 included over 50% of drugs intended for oncological uses, and PRIME designation approvals included only 30% for oncological uses. The authors also noted that it was common for oncological drugs to utilize multiple expedited pathways at the same time. However, they did not mention any data for the accelerated assessment pathway. And again, here, the y-axes are not the same. So since the authors observed that accelerated approvals in the FDA had the highest rate of approval for oncology medicines, they wanted to look into it more. So as a reminder, accelerated approval can be granted on the basis of surrogate endpoints or intermediate clinical endpoints. A surrogate endpoint is a means of measurement that predicts a clinical outcome to justify accelerated approval. For example, LDL cholesterol is a surrogate endpoint for cardiovascular morbidity. And an intermediate clinical endpoint is a measurable therapeutic effect that can be observed before morbidity or mortality and can be reasonably likely to predict clinical outcome. In general, surrogate endpoints are considered more reliable than intermediate clinical endpoints. So in figure A here, we can see that for the drugs approved based on surrogate endpoints between 2020 and 2023, more than 80% were for oncology drugs. This highlights the growing reliance on surrogate endpoints for oncology drug approvals. However, in B, it is interesting to note that there is a somewhat decreasing approval and increasing withdrawal of oncology drugs through the accelerated approval pathway. So connecting these two figures, accelerated approval requires post-confirmatory studies to show the effectiveness of the drug. Accelerated approval drugs are withdrawn if they lack evidence of effectiveness after these studies, or if the studies are not conducted at all. And here the authors suggested that the increase in withdrawals of oncological drugs may be linked to the lack of enforcement of post-marketing confirmatory trials. Next, the authors discussed Blenrep as a case study of a drug that was marketed in both the US and the EU using expedited pathways. So Blenrep is an antibody drug conjugate that was approved originally for the treatment of adults with multiple myeloma. It was granted accelerated approval by the FDA in February of 2020, and also conditional marketing by the EMA in the same month and year. DREAM3 was the confirmatory trial conducted in 2020 that studied the safety and efficacy of the drug on progression-free survival, which was their chosen clinical endpoint. However, it failed to meet that endpoint, and so the drug was withdrawn by the FDA in February 2023. It was then subsequently withdrawn from the EU a year after in February 2024. The authors noted that this one-year delay illustrates a lack of communication and collaboration between the FDA and EMA, or on a larger scale, a lack of global communication. In light of all this data, the authors discussed pre- and post-approval hurdles. First, surrogate endpoints are not always reliable. As we have observed, many oncology drugs previously approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints through accelerated approval have been withdrawn. Subsequently, confirmatory trials are crucial in determining the safety and effectiveness of drugs. From 2020 to 2023, it was found that only 15% of confirmatory trials were done or submitted, and the rest were delayed, ongoing, or pending. A different study found that in the last 30 years, 13% of drugs granted accelerated approval stayed on the market for a median of 10 years without confirmatory trials. This lack of confirmatory trials can mean potentially undiscovered long-term safety hazards to patients. Cost is often a major worry, as many medications with accelerated approval are extremely expensive and thus not accessible to the majority of the population. Medications may not be withdrawn from the market promptly, as we saw with the case study, whether it is due to the lack of global communication or the lack of prompt post-confirmatory study. And the general weakness of expedited pathways includes uncertainty of long-term efficacy and safety, inconsistent post-approval studies, different criteria for each pathway, and commercialization before full understanding of the product. So we will talk about the author's conclusions first, and then I will talk about some of my conclusions. So the authors emphasize the high rate for accelerated approval of oncology treatments and the importance of surrogate endpoints in this pathway specifically. They also suggested that the increase in cancer drug withdrawals is mostly due to the failure to perform post-marketing confirmatory trials, which are essential to confirm validity of surrogate endpoints. To this end, the authors recommended that regulatory policies increase post-approval trial surveillance to ensure that they are being done and patient populations are being protected. And on the bigger picture, global collaboration and harmonization will facilitate and promote optimized global expedited pathways. And then lastly, I wanted to discuss a couple of things that I personally noticed about the paper after reading it. First, I wish that they discussed more about the EU's pathways. I felt like they focused a lot on the US and FDA pathways, especially on our accelerated approval pathway. So it would have been great insight if they discussed the corresponding conditional marketing pathway, for example. Second, some of their data wasn't particularly convincing for me. For example, in this graph that I mentioned before, it shows the different distributions of oncology and non-oncology approvals. And the author said that the greatest percentage of oncology approvals was in the accelerated approvals. But since the y-axes are different, the proportions are a little bit off. And actually, the number of approvals for oncology drugs is the greatest in priority reviews. So I think it would have been interesting if they also discussed a little bit more about priority reviews. The authors also stated that the reason for the increase in withdrawal of oncology drugs was due to the use of surrogate endpoints and the lack of post-confirmatory trial surveillance. However, they don't elaborate or discuss on the post-confirmatory trial data, besides mentioning a couple of statistics. And I think it would have been interesting to see how many withdrawals were actually due to the lack of confirmatory trial data. And also maybe a discussion on current post-confirmatory trial policies and how they are lacking and not enough would have been insightful. I felt like they left a lot of questions unanswered and generally would have liked a more detailed discussion on the relationship between surrogate endpoints, confirmatory trials, and withdrawals. And lastly, I felt that the paper was overall a little bit unorganized. Some of their data was mentioned in early sections that did not really support logical flow. I had to reorganize a lot of the presentation to make it make sense. But overall, I thought this paper was interesting and can provide some preliminary insights into oncology approvals and withdrawals. And thank you.
Thank you, Tuti.